Hello, bros. Back with Popular Entertainments Through the Ages by Samuel McKechnie, a 1969 edition of an earlier publication. This is Chapter 3, The Comedy of Masks, which I will get into shortly. Hopefully, this is not as terrible looking as the last live broadcast was. I don't know why the it's not working. Chapter 3. The Comedy of Masks. Comedy of Masks. Masks. Change the photo. We'll change the photo. Change. Pop. This is pop. Yeah. This is pop. Popular Entertainments. I don't know why it's called Popular Entertainments, but save. I try to read all 18 pages. Probably take me an hour and a half, but shall do it. All right, let's go. Open the chat. Close this. Looks fine. Looks fine, bruv. Looks fine. All right. Pull down the chat. The Comedy of Masks. 1. While rogues and vagabonds in 16th century England were strolling towards the undreamed of glories of Shakespeare, their fellows of the streets and fairs of Italy were developing a new and popular form of entertainment. It was despised by the highbrows, but it swept from Italy the erudite comedy of the learned, delighted Europe for 200 years, and strongly influenced the works of Goldoni and Moliere. It gave to England such pantomime characters as Harlequin, Pantaloon, Columbine, and indirectly Clown. From it we derived our Punch and Judy show. These are the two principal reasons why it is a pleasurable necessity to take a brief look at the Comedy of Masks. Hello, Robs. But in any case, the comedy is worth looking at, apart from its connection with Punch and pantomime, as its rise and fall throw a valuable light on popular entertainments in general. Hello, Robs. How many times are you going to say it? Alright, let's go check out and see what your malfunction is. Vexo VR. Hello, bros. What do you got? Vexo's about to go to Vexo Land since he's acting like a fool. I'll take care of Vexo. Vexo, you gotta go, buddy. Vexo is gonna go bye-bye. Bye, Vexo. You had to go, buddy. Gave you a chance not to be a moron. What's up, Oreo? This low-born type of entertainment was called the Commedia dell'arte al improviso, or professional improvised comedy. You're going to be the same way and just keep saying hi? No, I'm not cool, and it's not my cool, it's you are cool. Or professional improvised comedy. It was termed improvised because instead of speaking words which authors put into their mouths, the players, given only an outline of the story, invented the dialogue as they went along, and it was called professional because it was played by members of the Actors Guild or Art, who alone had the skill that was necessary to improvise the lines. The actors represented stock characters and, in general, wore leathern masks which covered the upper portion of the face and left the mouth unhampered. From this comes another name by which it is known, the Commedia a Maschera, or Comedy of Masks. Hi, motherfucker. One more hi and you're going to have to go too, buddy. The Comedy of Masks developed early in the 16th century from the performances which maskers, merry andrews, buffoons, dancers, musicians, acrobats, conjurers, jugglers, and other unhonored mimes gave to audiences of common people on benches in the marketplaces and in booths at the fairs. Many of them sold such things as medicines and printed ballads, using their various arts to attract a crowd and to show off the wonderful properties of their goods. The description given by Coriat, who visited Venice in 1608, applies in all probability to the street performances of the 16th century. The principal place where they act is the first part of St. Mark Street, that reacheth betwixt the west from front of South Mark's Church and the opposite front of St. Germinian's Church, in which twice a day, that is in the morning and in the afternoon, you may see 5 or 6 several stages erected for them. Those that act upon the ground, being of the poorer sort of them, stand mostly commonly in the second part of St. Mark's. Not far from the gate of the Duke's Palace, these mountebanks at one end of their stage place their trunk, which is replenished with a world of newfangled trumperies. After the whole rabble of them is gotten up to the stage, whereof some wear vizards, being disguised like fools in a play, some that are women, for there are divers also amongst them, are attired with habits according to that person that they sustain. After I say they are all upon the stage, the music begins, sometimes vocal, sometimes instrumental, and sometimes both together. This music is a preamble and introduction to the ensuing matter. In the meantime, with the music players, the principal mountebank, which is the captain and ringleader of all the rest, opens his trunk and sets abroach his wares. After the music hath ceased, he maketh an oration to the audience of half an hour long, or almost an hour, wherein he doth most hyperbolically extol the virtue of his drugs and confections. Let's take a look at him. Up and Downs at Bartholomew Fair, about 1728. A scene, Pole Devil, Pole Baker, and Flockton's booth at Bartholomew Fair, 1790. Bartholomew Fair, as seen by George Cruikshank. And then we got this. The Industrious Prentice, Lord Mayor of London, by William Hogarth. Try to get that glare off there. There's the fair. Though many of them are very counterfeit and false, truly I often wondered at many of these natural orators, for they would tell their tales with such admirable volubility and plausible grace, even extempore, and seasoned with that singular variety of elegant jests and witty conceits, that they did often strike admiration into strangers that never heard them before. And by how much the more eloquent these naturalists are, by so much the greater audience they draw unto them. and the more ware they sell. After the chiefest mountebank's first speech is ended, he delivereth out his commodities by little and little, the jester still playing his part, and the musicians singing and playing upon their instruments. The principal things that they sell are oils, sovereign waters, amorous songs printed, apothecary drugs, and a commonweal of other trifles. What the hell is a commonweal? Is that a commonwealth? The head mountebank at every time that he delivereth out anything, maketh an extemporal speech, which he doth eftsoons intermingle with such savory jest, but spiced now and then with singular scurrility, that their minister passing mirth and laughter to the whole company, which perhaps may consist of 1,000 people that flock together about one of the stages. I have observed marvelous strange matters done by some of these mountebanks, for I saw one of them hold the viper in his hand and play with his string a quarter of an hour together, and yet receive no hurt, though another man should have been presently stung to death with it. Also I have seen a mountebank hackle and gash his naked arm with a knife most pitifully to behold, so that the blood hath streamed out in great abundance. And by, after he hath applied a certain oil unto it, wherewith he hath incontinent both stanched the blood and so thoroughly healed the wounds and gashes, that when he hath afterward showed us his arm again, we could not possibly perceive the least token of a gash. This trick is similar to one that has already been described, the cutting of one's nose, and it will therefore serve as an example of how tricks, which were interesting in themselves, could be turned into effective advertisements for oils or ointments. One of the illustrations shows a typical mountebank's stage, which is erected in front of a house. A masked player is fingering a guitar, another is intriguingly peeping through an opening in the curtain, and perched at the end of a pole is a small monkey. The mountebank has opened his trunk and set abroach his wares. On a stage like this, the mountebank sometimes took part in a play, in which he humorously impersonated a doctor, and a cure for the toothache given in a later play is absurd enough to have been derived from one of these open-air performances. Hold a ripe apple in your mouth and put your head in the oven. Before the apple is cooked, your toothache will be gone. Other strolling entertainers who accompanied mountebanks span eggs on a stick, capered about with brimming bowls of water on their heads, charmed snakes, exhibited trained dogs, and did all sorts of acrobatic feats. The combination of popular entertainment and business is still to be met with even in the heart of London. Mountebanks still deliver amusing speeches, or go the length of having a strong man as partner. Stripped to the waist, the partner performs feats of strength, and so illustrates the physical perfection which may be secured if the spectator will simply swallow some of the marvelous liquid or pills which are offered so cheaply. Nor is it so very long ago since one of the most highly paid of popular entertainers, Dr. Walford Bodie, was making lovely the outside of music halls with rows of crutches, leg supports, surgical boots, and other implements which had been discarded by some of the patients whom he had marvelously cured. He advertised in the newspapers his electric liniment and other electric remedies at 1s, 1.5d. I'm not sure what those. It's not pence. Quid, no, and 2s. A bottle obtainable from all chemists. Maybe it's silver. Or the Bodie Electric Drug Company, London. Mr. C.B. Cochrane, who has done so much for the theater, tells in Streets of a Showman of an early experience in America. We traveled with a booth. The performers paraded outside as they did at the fairs in England. Then a drama was played in which Dr. Greenberg appeared as the hero, and at the end of the play, before the audience dispersed, the doctor made a flamboyant speech recommending an ointment they had for sale. And while he was eulogizing the ointment, the members of his company had to go among the audience and sell it. I had 4 weeks with Dr. Greenberg, earning $25 a week for my acting and a percentage on the amount of ointment I sold. This is as close a parallel as one could hope for between a modern charlatan and those of 16th century Italy, who impersonated a doctor in a play and then, with the aid of their fellow actors, sold medicines. Early in the 16th century, the strollers of various descriptions began to combine their talents, forming groups of about a dozen players and producing the new type of entertainment known as the comedy of masks. So popular did it become that companies sprang up all over Italy. In a short time, the best of the companies came under the patronage of noblemen. A prosperous troupe of players on their travels is described by Goldoni, who, besides writing every conceivable form of play, devised outline plots for the comedy of masks. He lived at a later date than that which we are dealing, but the companies were still the same size, and his description will enable us to get a good idea of what the earlier travelers were like. He was 14 at the time and had run away and hidden in a ship, which was to carry a troupe whose performance he had seen. When the bark set sail on its 3 days' voyage, he emerged and received a welcome. Many years later, he wrote, "In the aggregate, this troupe aboard ship presented a pleasing sight. A dozen people, as many actors as actresses, a prompter, a stage carpenter, a property man, 4 maids, 2 wet nurses, children of all ages, dogs, cats, monkeys, parrots, birds, pigeons." These fuckers like making lists. "And a lamb. It was Noah's Ark. We gambled, laughed, frolicked, and played jokes till the dinner bell rang. Then rushed to the table. Macaroni. We fell upon it and devoured 3 soup tureens full, beef a la mode, cold mutton, a loin of veal, a dessert, and a first-rate wine. Ah, what a good dinner. We remained 4 hours at the table playing various instruments and singing a good deal." Another lively writer describes the arrival in a town of an early company. When they enter a town, they let everyone know of their arrival by beating a drum. The leading lady, dressed as a man and with a sword in her hand, goes in front and invites the people to a comedy or a tragedy which is to be presented in a palace or the Pilgrim's Inn. The common people, being eager for novelties and curious by nature, pay their coppers and crowd into the room, where there is a temporary stage and a scene done crudely in charcoal. It will be seen from the foregoing paragraph that the actors produce plays other than comedies. Only in comedy, however, did they achieve any lasting results. The presence of the woman player is also noteworthy, as the strollers of the comedy of masks were the first to introduce professional actresses in place of the boys, and young men who had hitherto played the female roles. More than 100 years elapsed before the reform was followed on the English stage. The women in the Italian comedies, like the men, were useful in many directions. They danced, sang, played musical instruments, walked on the rope, performed acrobatic tricks, and when acting, they frequently spoke the most outrageous lines in the comedy. It must be admitted that the words and actions of the players contained more than a little of that obscenity which is so often a feature of popular entertainments and others. However, they were there to amuse, not to elevate morally. And as they were not in the business for philanthropic reasons, they conformed to the laws laid down by their patrons. If they had found that it paid them better to play moralities, they would have done so. This mercenary spirit may be deplorable, but unless one continually bears in mind the fact that popular entertainers are popular simply because they supply the type of fare which the public wants, the whole position will be misunderstood. Let's go back and look at the illustration. Grimaldi in the pantomime, Harlequin and the Red Dwarf. The actors were not supplied with the dialogue. All that was written down was the names of the characters, the exits and entrances, and the nature, not the details of what was to take place during particular scenes. The scenario was hung up where it could be conveniently referred to by the players before they entered, and then they were left to their own ample resources. The story was always complicated and full of action, and usually it took the form of a love intrigue that was doubled or even tripled. The actors and actresses engaged in this part, which was only a peg on which to hang the jests and antics of the comic characters, were clearly differentiated from the other players. They did not wear masks. Their attire was that of the well-to-do classes, and they spoke in a cultured manner. The lovers delivered high-flown philosophical speeches on the nature of the passion in general and compared themselves to mythological beings such as Tantalus, whose torture was re-inflicted upon their hapless selves by the withholding of the food and drink of love. Of all these typically highbrow utterances, the comic characters made the utmost fun, and they mimicked them in love intrigues of their own. An outstanding feature of the performances was the comic business known as Lazzi, by which a buffoon broke into a scene that was in progress. One lazo, for example, was performed when two hungry servants had brought out their mistress, whose attention one of them had attracted by groaning. While the other was explaining their plight to her, the first famished player ate an imaginary hatful of cherries and threw the stones into the face of his companion, and also caught imaginary flies and chopped off their wings. The art of the player was to do such things, whether without distracting from, but rather adding to, the effect of the dialogue that was taking place. Dumb show was also present in many other pieces of comic business, as when one player pretended to tie his lace, caught two other characters by the foot, upset them, and fled. A very popular form of horseplay was the mock fight, in which the combatants belabored one another in the most extravagant manner imaginable. A modern example takes place in the circus ring when two clowns set about one another, hit themselves staggering blows, used their feet, and so on. Charlie Chaplin can be seen at it in more than one film. In order that particularly important points of the story should not fail to be grasped by the audience, the relative passages were memorized. Actors were assisted also by a stock of speeches which they used on suitable occasions, and they possessed a wealth of jokes and repartee. As regards any individual play, spontaneous bits of humor, which were too good to be trusted to even excellent memories, were written down along with the scenario. In the same manner were preserved the essential parts of the dialogue of any play which had been extemporized so successfully that it was profitable to repeat it frequently. It became customary in the later days of the comedy of masks to write down in its entirety the dialogue of the love scenes and other serious parts of the plays, as the actors who played such scenes had gotten into the habit of depending upon their stock of ready-made speeches, which had therefore become hackneyed. Acting under the conditions that have been outlined, it was necessary that a player who wished to excel as one of the comic characters should possess and cultivate a variety of qualities. He had to be light on his feet and a skillful acrobat, for a good effect could be secured by tripping over something, by tumbling head over heels on receiving a blow, by suddenly leaping down beside, at the back of, in front of, or on top of someone who was passing beneath a window. The singing of comic songs was part of the actor's business. Imagination was necessary for the invention of words and actions. Cooperation with the other players demanded the presence of intelligence and the absence of selfishness, for the actors depended a great deal upon inspiring one another by leads for witty answers or amusing pieces of business. A player, besides unselfishness, imagination, and intelligence, required the ability to exercise these qualities without a moment's hesitation. It was necessary that he should be a good all-around actor, as he had to take part in dialogues and by himself might have to act a scene in dumb show. An actor rarely played more than one part or type of part, and some distinguished players became known by the name of the character they impersonated. When players had the requisite talents and had been acting together for some time, the performances they gave were delightfully and almost incredibly spontaneous. This was so much the case in the elegant improvised comedies which were produced in Paris by the Italian players, who were fascinating the public, that rivals denounced Riccoboni and his wife, both of whom were clever writers as well as accomplished players, and said that they really wrote the comedies which the company professed to improvise. A French dramatist, La Motte, therefore sketched the plot of a 5-act play, and the Italians were challenged to improvise a performance. They accepted the challenge. On the morning of the performance, Riccoboni received the outline of the play, and in the manner adopted when a new play had to be got ready, explained the story to the company, allocated parts, and hung up the scenario in its usual place. When the curtain was drawn, the theater was crowded with people who had come to see the discomfiture or the triumph of the players. They witnessed the triumph of the Italians. 3. The masked characters invented by the actors were almost countless. Strolling all over Italy and picking up new recruits as they went along, the players became familiar with the distinguishing traits of character of the inhabitants of each locality. They invested a character with the traits, gave him an appropriate mask, and put into his mouth the local dialect. Most of the masks have long since disappeared. The others have altered very much, but some are still recognizable. There were Pantalone or Pantaloon, who has aged very much during the century. In Shakespeare's time, he was lean and slippered and played the 6th of the 7 parts, which are played by one man in his time. Now, in the Harlequinade, he is a dithering old man barely able to play the last part. He was a good-hearted Venetian merchant, and in his name is perhaps a reminder of the glory of ancient Venice. Some authorities think that his name is derived from that of the ancient patron saint of Venice, Saint Pantaleon. Others that it comes from Piantaleon, or plant the lion, the reference being to the planting of the lioned banner of Saint Mark on various islands of the Mediterranean. However, this may be, and one important authority does not venture to give the derivation of his name. He has a connection with the Venetian possession in the Mediterranean. When the Turks captured Negroponte in the late 15th century, Pantalone, like the rest of Venice, adopted a black robe as a sign of mourning. He wore a little woolen skull cap, a red waistcoat, long red breeches, and red slippers. Beneath the mask, which covered the upper half of his face, jutted forth long mustaches and a pointed beard. He was sometimes an old bachelor, more often a widower with an only daughter, who was the apple of his eye, and he was the dupe of other characters. In the hands of Goldini, he became more wide awake. Although I am old, says Pantalone, in The Swindler, I am not afraid. And if I don't know how to use a sword, I have enough of a tongue to give my reasons, in the face of no matter whom. Alas, when he came to England in the early 18th century to take up permanent residence, not as previously on a visit. He had lost his tongue, although he was able to speak in Italy, for he crossed as a pantomime character from the fairs of Paris, where dumb show had been imposed on the actors by the authorities. Il Daughter was the second old man of the comedies. The doctor wore an academic gown, and whether the degree that he had taken was in medicine, law, or philosophy, he always displayed his learning in pompous absurdities. The incorrigibly low-brow actors spared him nothing. They caused him to deliver his high-sounding but incomprehensible legal jargon, the illogical syllogisms by which he proved the most astonishing things, and all his other pedantic utterances in a broad dialect that was used by the not lettered, an Italian mountebank of the 17th century after Dujardin. Let's see what the second page has. Scapino, Cap Zerbino, Policinello, Sig Lucretia, Scaramuccia, Fracasso, characters of the comedy of masks by Calotte. The creation of the Spanish Capitano, known as Fracasso or Matamoros, and resembled by other masks, was the revenge which the Italians took upon the foreign soldiers who conquered Italy in the early 16th century. The Capitano was a terrifying figure to behold. He was loaded with weapons and twirled in his long mustachios, and he boasted, swore, and frowned in a manner that was in keeping with his fierce appearance. But, like the bully of the popular imagination, if anyone stood up to him, he ingloriously turned tail and fled. When the Spaniards became less powerful in Italy, their representative was changed from a Capitano into Scaramuccia, the famous Scaramouche, a Don who continued the boasting and the displaying of cowardice. The most famous Scaramouche who ever lived was Tiberio Fiorelli of Naples, wandering about penniless as a very young man about 1627. Hello, Bobs. After a row with his father, who was a captain in the army, Fiorelli fell in with a strolling troupe of comedians. Have you reached your 50 goal mark yet? Like himself, they were in financial straits. He joined them, played the part of Scaramouche, and packed the theater. By the time he had reached his early 30s, he had gained the favor, while playing with the Italians in Paris, of Louis VIII and the Queen. In 1673, he visited London with a troupe and created such a sensation that after he had departed, his performance was imitated. Concerning the origin of Pulcinella, who has developed into Punch, there is a great deal of controversy. It is believed by some authorities that he comes from ancient Rome, this theory being mainly based on the resemblance between an old bronze figure and Pulcinello. Both of them have a humped back, protuberant breast, and beaked nose, but the bronze figure might not be that of a stage character at all, and in any case, the original Pulcinella of the Comedy of Masks did not possess these physical characteristics. Others hold that he is descended from Pulcinella dalla Carceri, a grotesque patriot of the 13th century. It is believed by some that his creator was a 16th century peasant, Puccio Dianello, who lived in Acera, a town near Naples. A company of strolling comedians is said to have visited a field where peasants were harvesting and found themselves being subject to a steady flow of humorous and cutting interruptions. Getting tired of it, they returned sally for sally and concentrated their fire upon Puccio Dianello, who, besides being one of their wittiest interrupters, had a comic face and long nose, which offered a target for their wit. The peasant replied, and finally the professional comedians, outwitted and red-faced, returned to the town. It then struck them that the peasant would be an acquisition to the company, and when they put the proposition to him, he accepted their offer. In his white shirt and white trousers, the long-nosed peasant soon became one of the most popular comedians in the country. The credit for inventing the character, however, probably belongs to Silvio Fiorillo, who, by his skill and popularity in the role of the Spanish Capitano, had earned the name of Captain Matamoros, who in several ways closely resembled Pulcinella. About the beginning of the 17th century, it is believed he introduced Pulcinella as a white-dressed servant from the country. The peasant gradually became the burlesque representative of the working class of Naples and acquired the various characteristics by which he is now recognized. Columbina, whose descendant is the pirouetting Columbine, did not wear a mask, and her costume and dialect were those of whatever locality she cared to represent. She was known by other names such as Rosetta, Diamantina, and Carmosina. Always a smart and saucy young lady, she was sometimes the mistress, but generally the maid. Her love affairs with Arlecchino, Pulcinella, or some other mask brought about quarrels and peacemakings between her and Pasquella, who was usually a widow. Brigella was the servant of some rich young rake, in whose love affairs he was always willing to be of assistance. For a consideration, he was ready to help anyone who required the services of a clever and unscrupulous rogue. He lent some of his characteristics to our modern clown. Arlecchino, his fellow servant, was the butt for his mischievous wit, and they were the most popular partners in the comedy of masks. In one play, Brigella, Arlecchino, and Pantaloon, who in this case was a servant, were tricked by their masters. Pretending to admire the courage of Pantaloon, the young Venetians prayed him to guard during the night the body of a deceased servant, and he consented against his will. They had persuaded Arlecchino to lie on the bed covered with a white sheet, and he heaved about and uttered huge sighs. But soon he ceased to laugh and thought only of imitating Pantaloon, who hid himself, for Brigella arrived disguised as the devil with a torch. They both fled in terror, and when the devil saw that instead of chasing only the watcher, he was also in pursuit of the dead man, he fell to the ground, and the three of them rolled about in an agony of fright. Their masters arrived and made fun of them so that they regained their senses, but only after a very amusing display of comic business. From Brigella's brother, Pedrolino, whose face was covered with white flour, it is thought by some writers that Perrault is descended. At any rate, he was an Italian lout transformed in France. The brothers Parfait said that Perrault was derived from one of the two different Pulcinellos who existed in Naples, one of them being a crafty schemer, and the other, from whom Perrault they believed was descended, being a stupid character. Pugin said that the Perrault type, at first an imitation of the Neapolitan Pulcinella, whose costume was almost exactly similar to Perrault's, did not exist in Italy. Perrault was created in Paris by the Italian comedians resident there, altered to suit the French taste, and turned into a character completely, purely and absolutely French. Nowadays, one may see many different types of Perrault, but he always wears the loose white costume in which, as Pedrolino or Pulcinella, he first appeared in Italy. The status of Arlecchino, who is our harlequin, was such that he actually gave his name to a form of entertainment which we still see at Christmas, the harlequinade. In the comedy of masks, he was one of the most important characters. A country servant, he wore a tight-fitting suit, all rags and patches, and carried at his belt a wooden sword. Under his black half mask was a dark beard. He was silly, gluttonous, always in love, and continually earning cuffs and kicks. But although he was not nimble of wit, he was nimble of limb, and this was signified by the hare's foot with which his smell, bro. What the hell does that mean? Which his soft cap was decorated. He was supple, agile, and gay. In the second half of the 17th century, Harlequin's character and dress underwent a notable change at the hands of Joseph Dominique Biancolelli, who visited Paris and there turned the silly creature into a brilliant wit whose repartees were devastating. He improved the material of the dress and transformed the rags and patches into a beautiful design. On his native soil, however, Harlequin still remained the same. Early in the century following that in which Biancolelli had transformed the part in Paris, Addison, who had been to Italy, said that Harlequin's part is made up of blunders and absurdities. He is to mistake one name for another, to forget his errands, to stumble over queens, and to run his head against every post that stands in his way. Even after the middle of the 18th century, it was complained that a new Italian performer in Paris had preserved too much of the style of acting the part in his own country, that he was balourd, niais et sot, whereas the French demanded, among other things, skill in acting, suppleness in movement, and gracefulness throughout. Or is it thought? No, it's throughout. In Italy, there were at this time a few skilled masked actors, such as Antonio Sacchi, who vastly improved the part of Harlequin, while, leaving him still a blockhead, he put into his mouth the words of famous orators, poets, philosophers, and others, and secured very amusing effects from the contrast between the excellence of the speeches and the stupidity of the speaker. But the leavening of intelligence supplied by Sacchi and a few other masked actors did not suffice to make palatable to those with taste the fare that was now being offered by the vast majority of the comedies. Apart altogether from the indecency of the performances, which was no new feature, they lacked the saving grace of humor. In addition, they were not so much improvised by consummate actors as copied by non-creative players from originals which had become hackneyed. 4. For all these reasons, Goldani set himself the difficult task of sweeping the whole comedy of masks out of existence. In the face of great opposition, he brought about the change gradually. He proceeded from the writing of scenarios in the usual manner, but with more skill, to the writing of scenarios in which the principal role was not left to improvisation. Then he introduced the masks by their old names into fully written comedies, and finally he wrote ordinary comedies in which he chose the characters for himself instead of being bound down to the introduction of the conventional masks. Although, strictly speaking, it is outside the scope of this chapter, it is worthwhile, seeing we are on the spot, to glance at the new form of popular entertainment introduced by Goldoni. He took many of his characters from the lower classes, and departing from the custom of making them buffoons, he drew the common people of Venice realistically and lovingly. Eventually, he won their favor to such an extent that even today they adore him. When H.C. Chatfield Taylor was engaged upon his biography of Goldani, shortly before the war, he visited Venice and employed the telephone operator at his hotel to transcribe some passages from a book he had borrowed. Knowing that it was to be used for a life of Goldoni in English, she refused to accept any remuneration for her work, saying that she wished to do her share in making dear Papa Goldoni known abroad. That is what comes of being a really good purveyor of popular entertainment. The comedies of Venetian life, which today are accounted his best plays, were written by Goldoni against his own inclinations in order to please the million. He was a practical man of the theater, like Shakespeare, and like him, he often followed the very reasonable course of writing to suit not his own taste, but those of the people upon whom he depended for a living. Both of them wrote to fill the theater, and they achieved their object. They wrote with remarkable speed and did not have time to put that polish to their work which would have pleased the higher classes, but the absence of which was unremarked by the multitude. Yet the plays which were most popular in their own time, and sometimes even the plays which they wrote against their own inclination, were their best, especially in the case of the Italian dramatist. He wished to write refined comedy in the French style, but was obliged to pen undying pictures of Venetian life in order to please his lowbrow audiences. The influence of the comedy of masks was felt not only in refined theatrical circles in Paris, but also in the booths of the great fairs of Saint-Germain and Saint-Laurent. About the middle of the 17th century, buffoons, tumblers, jugglers, conjurers, and other popular entertainers began to give short open-air and then booth performances of pieces which had a cast of only 3 or 4 actors. There were some Italians among the performers, and these introduced, among other characters of the comedy of masks, Pantaloon, Harlequin, Scaramouche, and Columbine. The dialogue of the plays, as in the purely Italian comedy of masks at this time, was partly improvised and partly memorized, and there was plenty of indecency in horseplay. So great were the crowds that flocked to the entertainments at the fairs that the Comédie Française and other theaters suffered very much from the competition. Accordingly, as they had the support of the authorities, they secured the laying of various disabilities upon their humble rivals. The actors of the fairs, forains they were called, were irrepressible. When they were forbidden, for example, to speak in their comedies, they acted in pantomime and let down from the ceiling of the stage scrolls of verses which explained the salient parts of the story. They could not very well have got nearer to the form of the silent film, with its pantomimic acting and its explanatory captions. It was then forbidden to them to display the scrolls, so they handed out to the audience printed outlines of the plot with the songs in full, and when the orchestra played the air, the audience sang the words. They could not very well have got nearer to the spirit of the music hall at its best. But apart from any resemblance, their performances may have had to some of our popular entertainments. They had founded, with their silent acting, juggling, conjuring tricks, and gymnastics, a new type, the modern pantomime. Not the pantomime as it is today, but the early form of pantomime, which came to England at the beginning of the 18th century. The characters were created by the popular entertainers of the Italian streets and fairs. The method of combining their talents in pantomime was devised by the popular entertainers of the Paris fairs. And when pantomime came to England, it did not become the rage and had enlisted the services of conjurers, tumblers, rope dancers, and other popular entertainers who were to be found at the English fairs. The comedy of masks gave us more or less directly both the pantomime and punch. As the puppet secured his greatest popularity before the introduction of pantomime, it will be chronologically appropriate to deal next with the Punch and Judy show. Opening of the new theater of the Comédie Italienne in Paris after the death of Dominique Biancolelli, the famous Harlequin, in 1688. Columbine presents to the new actor of the part the mask and the bat of Harlequin. In the background is Biancolelli's widow mourning at her husband's tomb. The Puppet Master by Robert Austin, R.E. from Masters of Etching, number 25, by permission of the studio. Alright, I guess that's it. Bruv. What do we got? What the fuck?